first thing I should say is that I thought the trip was fine for longer than it actually was. I don't mean I was in danger and ignoring it in some dramatic way. I mean, if you had asked me on the second day how it was going, I would have said great, maybe even sent you a photo and said I'd finally found a route I wanted to come back to. That part bothers me now more than the rest of it in some ways. I was happy. I was sleeping well. I was exactly where I wanted to be. And all through that, there was already something moving around me that I wasn't accounting for. I know that now because of the photos. At the time, I thought I was alone. I thought I was doing what I'd done on a bunch of other trips, which was get far enough out that you stop hearing the rest of the world, and your brain drops into a quieter gear. That was the whole point. I'd been living out of a van for a few years by then, taking photos, doing small brand work when it came in, selling prints online, saying yes to jobs that paid badly if they got me somewhere worth shooting. It wasn't a stable life exactly, but it fit me better than the one I had before it. My mom still treated it like a pause in my life, like at any point I was going to come to my senses and get an apartment with dishes that matched, and a couch that had to stay in one place because I was paying for walls around it. She sent me listings every couple of weeks without saying much. Just links. Good light, 2 bedrooms, close to a park. Like if she kept tossing those into my phone, one of them would catch me on a weekday. I used to laugh about it with a friend of mine from college, but after this trip, I stopped laughing about a lot of stuff that had seemed harmless before. Anyway, this route in the southern Appalachians was supposed to be simple. 5-day loop, national forest land, enough elevation changes to keep the light interesting, enough distance from roads and towns to get a real dark sky at night. I wanted Milky Way shots without any glow on the horizon, and that meant going deep enough that you paid for it with your legs. I liked that part. You earn better pictures when you have to carry your own bed into the dark to get them. My camera had 2 card slots, and I always kept both running because years before that, I'd lost a card in Utah, and I'd spent half a day on my knees in gravel trying to find something the size of a fingernail, while wind pushed dust into my mouth. After that, I quit trusting single copies of anything. That decision is the only reason I have proof of what happened. I got to the trailhead a little before noon, took a picture of the sign and sent it to my mom, because if I didn't, and went off-grid for 5 days, she'd start making calls that ended with a county deputy checking a parking lot for a van with my plates. I knew the whole chain already. My aunt would get involved by dinner. Somebody would bring up bears. My mom always brings up bears because bears are easier to imagine than men. The first day was good in that very plain way good hiking days are good. The weather held. The trail was dry enough to move quickly. I passed one older couple in the first hour, both in matching rain jackets bright enough that you could have found each other from space. We did the nod and moved on. After that, it was just me. That first afternoon, I stopped at a break in the ridge where fog was collecting in the valleys below and sat there longer than I meant to. The light had that washed, low, late-season look to it, and every few minutes one of the hollows would fill a little more, and another would open back up. I kept shooting because it wouldn't hold still. When I finally packed the camera and stood up, I checked the image count without really meaning to. It was a little higher than it should have been, not by some huge amount, just enough that I frowned at it for a second. I tried to replay the last hour in my head, and I couldn't line the number up with what I remembered doing. I remember standing there with one shoulder strap half on, looking at the top screen and trying to decide whether I cared. In the end, I decided I didn't. I'd been shooting fast. Maybe I held the remote down longer than I thought. Maybe I bumped it while moving the tripod, whatever. It was that level of thing. Too small to build meaning around. I made camp around 5 in a flat spot between hemlocks that was off the trail enough to feel private, but not so hidden that I had to fight brush to get in and out. Hung my food, set the tent, ate cold food because I was too lazy to fire up the stove, brushed my teeth, got inside. I had this old habit of lying awake for a while the first night of any trip, just listening to the place and letting my body get used to not hearing appliances, roads, neighbors, any of that. It always takes a bit. I was in that drift-off stage where you're not asleep, but your thoughts have started loosening from each other, when the light in the tent changed. It didn't brighten or swing the way it would with a flashlight. It just dimmed for a second. A soft shift through the fabric like something had moved between the sky and the nylon. I lay there and kept looking at the same patch of wall, waiting for it to happen again. It didn't. I don't know how long I waited before unzipping the door. Long enough that I almost talked myself out of it. When I opened it and leaned out, the clearing was empty. The trees weren't moving. There was no headlamp somewhere downhill, no road glow through branches, nothing. I remember feeling silly with half my body out of the tent, looking into black trees in my long underwear, with my toothbrush still inside one shoe, because that's where I put it so I don't lose it. I stayed there until the cold got into my face and neck, then zipped back up and told myself a cloud passed over. I tried to remember if there had been clouds when I crawled into the tent. I couldn't. That should have been the end of it. It almost was. Day 2 started cleanly enough that I was already half out from under the night before by breakfast. That's the thing about small, wrong moments out there. Morning shrinks them. The coffee water boiled, the food bag came down, my hands had jobs to do, and by the time I was walking again, it already felt overblown. The trail dropped into a hollow where everything stayed damp and green longer than it should have that late in the season, then climbed back out onto a ridge with long views through haze. I shot there too. I remember thinking I was getting the best set I'd had in months, which is maybe the most irritating part in hindsight. I was having a productive trip. That afternoon I found a campsite, set the tent, leaned my pack against a hemlock, and went back a quarter-mile to an outcrop for sunset. I sat there for an hour easy, maybe more, taking pictures, not taking pictures, just looking. My dad would have hated the whole thing. He was one of those men who can be outdoors for about 20 minutes before he starts asking what the point is, but he loved color. He'd stop at a traffic light and comment on the red the way some people talk about a painting. Standing on that rock, I thought of him because of the sky. Not in a dramatic way, just one of those stupid little empty motions your brain still does with dead people, or you turn slightly like you're going to say, "Look at that," and there's nobody there. By the time I walked back to camp, it was dark enough that the headlamp had flattened everything outside its beam. When I got in, the pack was still against the tree where I'd left it, but the hip belt was turned the wrong way. That's such a dull sentence for how long I looked at it. It sounds like nothing. It felt like almost nothing. I just stood there with my headlamp on it, trying to work out how the whole thing had rotated without falling. The ground was flat. The pack was heavy. Wind could push it down. I couldn't figure what would turn it. I remember putting one hand on it and thinking maybe I'd left it that way and just remembered wrong. But the memory of leaving it was weirdly solid. Hip belt facing out, ready to pick up in the morning. I turned it back and got on with the night because what else was I going to do? Stand there assigning motive to a backpack. I woke once, sometime later, for no clear reason. No sound that I can point to even now. Just awake. The tent was still. The air felt cold enough that the tip of my nose hurt. I listened and heard nothing, and went back to sleep. In the morning, the food bag was still hanging where it should be, but the bowline at the end wasn't finished the way I finish it. I always tuck the tail. My grandfather taught me that knot when I was a kid, and for whatever reason that last movement is burned in. The tail was hanging loose. The knot was fine. It was holding. It just wasn't mine all the way. I stood there looking up at it long enough for my neck to ache. I tried to remember tying it the night before, and got almost all of it back, just not the end. I retied it and packed up. At that point, I still had explanations for everything. They just felt thin. That was the first day the trip stopped settling all the way back into place after something small happened. I kept walking, kept shooting, kept eating and filtering and doing all the normal things. But there was this low idle under everything. I noticed I was looking back down the trail more often. I noticed I was listening after I stopped moving, as if I expected the woods to say something once I'd gone quiet enough to hear it. I saw him on the third day. Late morning, ridge trail, good sightlines behind me. I'd stopped to drink and happened to look back. He was just there, maybe 200 yards down the path, far enough that I couldn't make out a face or much of anything beyond shape and a pack. I did what you do, lifted a hand. He didn't return it. He turned in this slow, easy way, no hurry at all, and moved toward the tree line. The thing I keep replaying is how he didn't fully disappear. He got to the trees and stopped with part of himself still visible, shoulder and a bit of the pack, like he'd gone through the motion of stepping off the trail but hadn't bothered to finish it. I watched him for maybe half a minute. He didn't move again. I told myself he was taking a piss, or he'd heard something in the brush, or he was one of those people who doesn't want to interact and thought I was the one making it weird by waving. I turned and kept going. My water bottle was in my hand, and I realized after a bit that I was squeezing it hard enough to make the plastic buckle. A couple hours later, the trail wrapped around a saddle and gave me a view across to the next ridge over. I looked over, and there was a figure there. Same distance, same general build, same not quite hidden position after he noticed me looking. I cannot tell you it was the same person, because I never saw him close enough for that. It felt like the same person. It felt like the same amount of person, if that makes sense. That was the part that started getting into me. The space between us stayed constant in a way that made my body understand something before my brain did. I never saw him move between those two places. I was exposed on that trail for long stretches. If he'd come up behind me, I should have seen him. If he'd dropped low and crossed through the drainage, he'd have had to push through thick rhododendron and deadfall that would have slowed anyone down. I didn't work any of that out right then. I just started moving faster. Tripod banging the side of my pack, breath too high in my chest. All of it still deniable enough that I was embarrassed by my own reaction even while I was having it. That's what I mean about the story staying flat too long in the wrong draft. In real life, you don't get one clean shift into fear. You keep trying to back out of it while your body keeps moving deeper in. I made camp early that day because I wanted light around me, and because I couldn't stop scanning the trees once dusk started. I found a flat spot behind a few hemlocks, put the tent up, hung the food, ate too fast, and kept telling myself I was going to skip the night shooting and just get moving at first light. Then full dark came, and the sky was clear, and I set the camera up anyway. I still don't know why. Pride, maybe. Stubbornness. The feeling that if I let myself stop doing the thing I came there to do because of one far-off stranger, then I was confirming something I didn't want to confirm. I put the tripod low and aimed toward the tree line instead of the sky. Even that should have told me enough. I sat on a flat rock maybe 10 feet away with the remote in my pocket and kept triggering long exposures. Every time I tried to look up, my eyes slid back down to the same gaps between trunks. I kept doing it. I knew I was doing it. That's one of the parts that still feels worse to me, that loss of control over my own attention. Nothing moved. The whole time, nothing moved. The trees stayed trees. After a while, I started feeling stupid. Really stupid. Like I'd wound myself up over a hiker who didn't wave and a couple small things around camp that I probably did myself. I packed up and went back into the tent. I pulled the camera out to check the shots from slot 1 because that's what I always check first. At first, they looked normal. Same composition, stars moving, tree line black at the bottom. Then the timestamps jumped. One image, then another, then a gap of more than half an hour. I backed up and checked again because I thought maybe I'd scrolled too far. Same thing. There were supposed to be dozens of images in there. I knew exactly how often I'd triggered the shutter. They just weren't on the main card. I remember my fingers fumbling the card door because I was suddenly cold in a different way than I'd been outside. I swapped to the second card and found the same run. The missing half hour was all there. I went through slowly this time because my first pass had been too fast to trust. At first, I thought I was looking at one of the trunks catching a little starlight. Then in the next image, it wasn't in the same place, a little farther right. In the next, it had shape. In the next, it was obviously a person. He starts in the trees. Then he's closer. One exposure catches him moving, and his body is dragged into a pale smear through the dark. Then he's still again. Then another blur. Then the last clean one, and he's out in the clearing. Not at the tree line. Past it. Past where I would have accepted something out there and called it distance. He was close enough that I could look at that image and know exactly where I had been sitting when he was standing there. I set the camera down because my hands were jerking too much to hold it still, then grabbed it again almost immediately because I needed to see whether I'd seen it right. I checked the timestamps, the sequence, the gap on the other card, then went back to the clear frame and just stared at it until the little screen timed out and went black. I turned it back on and did it again. Then I went back through the earlier days. That part took longer because once I started finding him, I couldn't stop. Trailhead sign. Tiny shape near the edge of the trees in the background. Ridge overlook on day 1. Another one. Hollow on day 2. Harder to see, then easy once you've caught it. Outcrop at sunset. He's below me in the trees between the rock and my camp, looking uphill. I had to lower the camera at that point because I felt like I was going to be sick. I had this awful split in my head, where one part of me was trying to keep arranging facts, and the other had already accepted something much simpler, which was that I had been out there taking pictures while someone moved around me for days, and I had only now caught up to it. I don't know how long I sat there in the tent going through the same cluster of images. A long time. Long enough that the battery indicator dropped another bar. Long enough that my legs went half numb under the sleeping bag. I'd set the camera face down, stare at the tent wall, pick it back up, go to the clear image in the clearing, then back to the first day, then back again. I could not stop checking whether it was still there. That's where the rest of the night starts for me. Not with footsteps. The footsteps came later. The real turn was sitting there with proof in my hands and understanding that the quiet outside the tent no longer meant what it had meant an hour earlier. I put the camera away eventually because I couldn't keep looking at it, and because it had become impossible to ignore what was on the other side of the nylon. I had a folding knife on me, one of those cheap ones you buy at gas stations because the handle caught your eye, and it turns out decent enough for fruit and tape and all the dumb small jobs that pile up when you live on the road. I held it like it mattered. It didn't. I knew it didn't. My body was beyond that by then anyway. My jaw hurt from clenching. I kept realizing I'd stopped breathing properly and had to force air back in a little at a time because every full inhale felt too loud. For a while there was nothing. That was worse than if there had been immediate movement. If he'd rushed the tent, if he'd pulled at the zipper, if there had been one clear thing happening, I would at least have had a shape to respond to. Instead, there was a long stretch where I listened to quiet I no longer trusted and waited for my own mind to decide it had made everything worse than it was. Then nothing. Then I heard a step somewhere off to my left. A soft compression of leaves, that was all. I froze so hard my hand went numb around the knife. Another step, much later. Then another. He was circling the tent. Very slowly. One step, long pause. One step, long pause. I could track where he was from the sound. Left, behind, right, in front. Sitting position around the listener. He kept the same rough distance at first, just outside where I could picture touching through the wall, but close enough that there wasn't much space between his root and where I was lying. I don't know how long that went on, because time had stopped breaking into useful pieces. I only know the rhythm of it got into me. I started bracing ahead of each sound. At some point I said I had a gun. My voice came out thin and wrong and embarrassingly young. The steps stopped. The pause afterward was bad in a way I can't make elegant for you. It just went on and on. Enough time for my brain to backslide and start trying to invent easier versions of everything. Maybe the photos were corrupted. Maybe the gap on the first card was some weird write error. Maybe the figure in the clearing looked closer because of perspective. Maybe there hadn't been any steps. Then he answered from right outside the tent and said he knew I didn't. Those are the only direct words in the whole thing, and they're enough. He said them flatly, almost casually, like he was correcting a small thing. Then the circling started again. Same slow movement, same pauses. Noticeably closer than the others. Then a long pause. At one point, one step landed much closer than the others. Not right against the tent, but enough that my entire body seized up before I could stop it. That was the moment I bit the inside of my mouth. I tasted blood and didn't understand why for a second. Then realized how hard my teeth were pressed together. The next step went back out to the old distance. And the circle kept going like that. Closer one had just been part of it. I started crying somewhere in there without deciding to. Tears just running sideways into my ears while I tried not to make any sound. That went on too. Lowering onto leaves, fabric shifting against the ground. Then later, much later, the steps stopped, and I heard the sound of someone lowering themselves to the ground outside. Leaves pressed down. A small shift of fabric, another. Longer, then breathing, uneven. Longer exhale, shorter one, a little adjustment, then stillness. He stayed there long enough that I started counting breaths because counting was the only thing that kept my mind from flying apart. I lost count somewhere past 40. I started over. Lost it again. Fading. I don't know if he left after that, or if I stopped being able to hear him over my own body. The breathing was there, and then it wasn't. And I didn't move to check, because I knew if I looked, and he was still there, I wasn't going to survive the rest of the night in any useful state. I waited for gray light through the tent, and in my memory that took years. Then a second. Then morning slowly filling in. Nylon crammed into a pack, rushed, clumsy. I left as soon as I could see. I didn't break camp properly. I pulled stakes, crammed nylon into the pack, strapped things down wrong, left the food bag hanging because I couldn't bring myself to stand there under that branch working the rope through my hands again. My fingers had cramped around the knife so badly that I had to pry them open one by one. The dents in my palm lasted into the next day. I got on the trail and walked fast. Too fast for that terrain. My legs felt wrong, like I'd borrowed them from someone with different joints. I didn't look behind me. I wanted to in this horrible, constant way, like there was a string tied to the back of my eyes pulling them around. But I knew if I looked and saw him at that same distance again, then whatever thin line of function I still had was going to snap. I counted steps sometimes, lost count, started over. The trail through old growth on the way out was bad, because every gap between trunks looked exactly large enough to hold a person. I walked through that section staring straight ahead until my eyes watered. When I stopped to filter water, my hands shook so badly I spilled half the first bottle into the dirt. Watching it sink in triggered this awful comparison in my head to doing the same motion on day one. Same hands, same filter, while he was already somewhere around me. That's what I mean when I say the fear didn't reset between scenes. Once the photos happened, everything kept getting pulled backward through them. By the time I hit the last stretch, the rough, muddy section before the lot, I was tripping over roots because I was trying to move faster than my feet could place. I fell once and barked my shin on something hard enough that it bled through my sock. Didn't matter. The only part of the exit I remember clearly is the parking lot. Seeing my van where I'd left it. White, dirty, ordinary. Walking toward it with the keys already out because I didn't trust my hands to find them fast enough once I got there. And the tree line behind the lot staying empty the whole time. That was almost worse. I kept expecting him to appear there because at least then the whole thing would keep one shape. Instead, nothing came out. I threw my pack in, locked the doors, and sat with the engine off staring at the gap where the trail met the trees. I stayed there too long. 5 minutes maybe more. Long enough for the light to start changing. Long enough for my foot to cramp on the brake. Nothing came out. I drove anyway. Too fast on the forest road, then too fast again when I hit pavement. I stopped at a gas station in a small town because I needed water, and because I needed fluorescent light on tile, and a person behind a counter asking if I was okay in the most casual possible voice. I told her I was fine, just a long hike, and bought water I barely drank. Then I called the sheriff's non-emergency line from the van. A deputy called back within the hour. I told him about the figure, the circling, the voice, the missing images from one card and the intact ones on the other. He asked practical questions: location, dates, whether I thought it could have been another camper, whether anything was stolen. I answered them as well as I could. He gave me a case number. I wrote it on the back of a receipt and shoved it into the center console. Nobody ever called me back. I didn't call them again either. The backup card is still in the van. Little drawer above the bed where I keep spare batteries and cards, and the headlamp I replaced a month later because I didn't want to look at the old one anymore. I never moved those files onto my laptop. I never formatted that card. Every now and then, when I'm digging for something else, I see the edge of it in the case, and my whole body does the same small recoil before my mind catches up. They're still on it.
If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing. There's always another one coming.